Hi, folks. Since I've been following Women in Translation Month in August, I am thrilled to be in the company of translator Ranjana Kaul, who's actually a lawyer by day, and she has translated a very special Marathi short story collection, which is called Stepmother and Other Stories, into English for all of us. And the author Laxmibai Abhyankar is none other than her own grandmother, which I find really cool. But that's not the only special thing about her, because she was an extraordinary woman who wrote and fought for women's rights. And she was called a Nav Amtwadi, which actually means a new thinker. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And her stories actually take us back into this problematic times of, horse-driven carriages to child marriages. And, these stories shed lights on a time when things were on the brink of changing. That's what I find interesting. And especially to do with our outdated customs and belief, like treating widows poorly, not educating women. And all these stories are actually set in rural villages with such colorful characters who are driving these, each story, from narrow-minded mothers-in-laws to progressive and loving husbands to intrusive neighbors who enjoy gossiping all day. And these women protagonists defy traditional norms by, wearing Western clothes or taking care of a person who, irrespective of caste, or even studying further to pursue their ambitions. So join me in welcoming Ranjana, Lakshmibai's granddaughter, to understand more about how her stories changed regressive mindsets in the late 19th century. Welcome, Ranjana.
Thank you so much. Delighted, Michelle, to finally meet you in person beyond the emails of our own times, modern communication. But yes, for me, my goodness me, it's been a journey of self discovery. It's truly expanded my mind.
Yes, and that's what we're going to find out, what exactly did you learn from this whole process? And I actually read that your grandmother was way ahead of her time. Her progressive outlook was deeply influenced by her own grandfather, who was actually among the early pioneers of the Nav Matwadi social movement, right? Which actually rejected all the traditions and prevalent customs which subjugate women. So, can you please share an anecdote of your grandmother's relationship with her grandfather and how that was pivotal in sort of shaping her thinking and her writing?
Her grandfather was a personality in the middle 19th century. These are the first generation English educated in India. And you had stalwarts like him, which is Gopal Hari Deshmukh, they called him Lokhitvadi. His view on the subject was that without the emancipation of women and the disadvantage in those days, what you call caste, those that are adversely affected by their birth, so disadvantaged, India could never achieve the potential of political freedom without the emancipation of women and the disadvantaged. We are still struggling with it. And this is something that hit me, sort of right in the middle of the forehead. To think that this is his time was mid 1850s, her time was late 1888, 89, 90, around the turn of the century and the early part. I am in the 21st century. What's happened? I mean, what is happening? Is a question I ask myself. You use the term Navmatwadi. Now, Navmatwadi was for two reasons. People with new ideas. First, that they were seeking social transformation through emancipation, through education, together with political reform. Stalwarts like Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule were working for the disadvantaged, their own social ecosystem, emancipating them through the education in English language. And the third was those that focused only on political independence and did not, in fact, opposed social transformation involving emancipation of women and disadvantaged. Those were the three parallel sort of happenings, movements of those times. And of course, you've heard the name of Justice Ranade. What they were doing is to first and foremost reform their own community. All of these stories that she's written is about her own community. The aim of the exercise was that you must first individually absorb in your mind the transformation. You can do it one step at a time. That's not a problem. It's a human nature's progression. But you must do it and implement it in your own home first. And
Correct.
that home would consist of father, the patriarch, the mother, the matriarch, the educated or the uneducated son, the educated or uneducated daughter, daughter-in-law. Each one is a hero. And I imagine that given the fact that they were looking at all the pernicious customs and the traditions and the orthodoxy, that entire package seemed to be focused on women. And the Navmatwadi evaluated each one of these on the basis of rational and scientific meter and rejected it on those grounds. Not that, oh, this is old fashioned, let's just chuck it out, but that there is no basis for it. I imagine in today's modern English, you would call them rationalists. Not a very popular species presently. So where Laxmibai is, completely absorbed with her grandfather and so forth, is because she spent a lot of time in Pune in the Deshmukh Wada. That was her home. Her own father was amongst the first from the Bombay presidency to join the ICS, the Covenanted Service of India. So he was a collector in Sindh, in Hyderabad, meaning which is now. And she went to school there. But then, because she was very keen on languages and ancient languages and learning and poetry and so forth, she had private tutors. So what it is that she has this enabling ecosystem in her own home. And she's influenced on the top of it because she was spending a lot of time in Deshmukh Wada in Pune whenever her father was posted there. And happened to also marry somebody who was also committed to Navmatwadi, was a lawyer, and in fact encouraged her. And of course, if the mother was putting up a struggle and a fight, then she may not have done it with the same, or she then again may have. But clearly there was no opposition there, because everybody in that family was up to speed. And while she completely took to it, also because she was now encouraged by her own circumstances after marriage, she seemed to have a tremendously active public life. For me, it came as a serious shock. I can tell you that, Michelle. I couldn't believe it. I thought this must be somebody else.
Why was it a shock?
Well, I mean, when I met my grandfather, mother, she was pretty old. Actually, her mother, my great-grandmother, was a very stately, ramrod, stiff sort of a lady, used to hold her hand and walk. So when I found this little booklet in 67, I was in school and I was visiting Sangli House, Abhyankar House in Sangli with my parents. So my grandfather being a lawyer, if you read The Great Expectations, you know the description of Miss Havisham's home. So it was, that Sangli House was like Miss Havisham's home. That is to say, the offices and the library and all that, my grandfather, was exactly the way it would have been on 4th of April, 1935. Nobody had touched anything. And in the bedroom where I was sort of, running my finger over these my ambition always to be a lawyer. So I was running my finger, down the spines of all these books. And suddenly it touched a thin booklet. And I took it out. And there I read the name Lakshmi Tanaya. Tanaya in Marathi means sister. And my father, I remembered my father saying, she used to write under the pen name, pseudonym, Lakshmi Tanaya. So I took that booklet to him and I said, what are these? What is this thing? Then he started telling me all about her. I mean, I'm listening to him and I'm thinking, no.
This is not possible.
this is not it. Anyway, I left the book where it was, but in 1975, I went back to the Sangli and she had passed by then. The books, of course, were where they were. And this time I went to collect my grandfather's papers because I had started doing my PhD on the popular movements in the princely states. And he was a pioneer for the Deccan states, meaning that the subjects of princely India demanded a Bill of Rights and representative governments under their own ruler, under the Indian ruler. They did not support the colonial power.
British, yes.
Yeah. So I knew all the papers were there, so I had originals waiting for me, and I brought this little booklet back as well. Many years passed. I got married. I came to Delhi with my 7-8 trunks full of papers. I had no clue how I should get started because, papers need to be collated. They need to be indexed. They need to, I didn't know where to start and what to do. And a chance meeting, well, not a chance meeting, but met my husband's colleague who said that you have to be completely, something's wrong with you. Why are you sitting on all these papers? Do you not know how valuable they are? I said, no. So he said, no, this is rubbish. I mean, you have to go and meet the director of the Nehru Memorial, the foremost sort of research center for contemporary India. And you have to give these papers to them. So I said, right. So he fixed up a meeting. I went to meet Dr. Panigrahi, who heard me out, didn't say a word, got up, brought a file out of his cabinet and said, read this. So they were trying to trace G.R. Abhyankar papers for over a decade, almost 2 decades. And they had written to every possible Abhyankar they could find. And he said, I cannot believe that they are in Delhi. He's sitting in trunks in your house. I said, please send
That's
somebody.
So funny.
So I gave it.
Yeah.
Now, today, of course, the personal collection, G.R. Abhyankar personal collection, I have donated it to the library, and they're available for researchers. They're laminated, microfilm, all of that. But in that trunk went that little book as well. So when they took all the materials, and after about a month, they said that, the trunks are now empty, and we have one book which we found, which is not part of the collection. So I said, fine. So they sent the trunk and the book back. So now this time around, the little book found me.
What an origin story. I have to add, like, it's one of the most fascinating origin stories.
It's like please believe it or not. I mean, when I think of it, this little booklet, reprinted in 1914 or 15 by Arya Bhushan, sitting over there, I see it in 67, bring it back in, and in 78, 79, it comes back to me. So it was with me. And in due course of time, I thought that maybe I should read it now. So I did. And I quite liked those stories, but I wasn't sure of the quality because I am, I've schooled in Delhi. Even though I'm a Maharashtrian, I've schooled in Delhi. So this means that I have not had formal classroom instruction in the Marathi language.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I want to ask you next, which is, I mean, I find it fascinating. Usually when we think of translation, we think we need to master the language, obviously, right? You need to know the language to a certain extent in order to translate it. And you didn't know Marathi, right? Because you grew up in Delhi and
no,
you
I
went
knew
to Pune.
Marathi to speak.
Yes, I mean,
home.
To translate. Yeah.
No, to translate, no question about it. So in due course of time, over the years, of course, I finished school and college in Bombay, so forth, all of that. And I wanted to do law. So I was going to finish my BA in 71. So my parents in Pune, by then my father was posted in Pune. My father was in the Indian Army. So my parents, they said, so what do you want to do now? You're going to finish your BA. So I said, I'll join Government Law College in Bombay. So, okay, why? I said, but I want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer like my grandfather. Not that I'd seen him, but I just did. So what kind of law will you do? I said, well, I want to do criminal law and then I want to do international law. I had no idea what a tectonic impact that had on my mother. My father was pretty ambivalent. By the time I got back to Bombay, the first and foremost, I got a call from my cousin, who was a leading appellate lawyer in the Bombay High Court. And he said, how are you? You're back from holidays, this and that. Why don't you come and drop us? Come in and see us. I said, yeah, let's come. So I landed up sitting in his living room, in the drawing room. And after idhar udhar ki baatein, then he said, so what do you want to do? You'll soon finish BA. What is your plan? I said, I'll join Government Law College. He said, why? I said, why? To do law? He said, no, it's a useless profession. I said, but you are a lawyer. He said, no, with me, it's a different matter. I kept quiet. My sister-in-law sitting and smiling. So he said, you don't know. Did you see when you were coming in, all those fellows? Did you see their faces? I hadn't seen anybody. So I kept quiet. He said, did you also see my files? They're full of dust and cobwebs and all this. Well, there were no files. It says house and his living. So I said, have you spoken to my mother recently? So, so the conversation finished. I said, okay, fine. So now she's using sabotage or whatever. Next, after a couple of weeks, there's a phone call I used to live on Marine Drive in the women's students hostel. So there's a phone call in the superintendent's on her office. And then my uncle, who was Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court. So they're very unusual. Anyway, I went there and he said, then what is this? Your kaku is saying, where is she? Where is she vanished? She has not come. So I said, sir, I'll come on Sunday. So he said, no. You come to my office and we'll go together. So I walked down from Elphinstone to the High Court. And after telling me about the luminaries that had practiced in that building, then what do you want to do after BA? So by then, I said, so Kaka, what do you think I should do? So you go back to Pune. So what should I do in Pune? She said, you join the university. What should I do in the university? Oh, you do your MA. What subject? Oh, you can choose. You have a choice. You can do political science. You can do history. I said, no, why don't you tell me? Do MA history. Okay. I noted, however, that he didn't say join Law College, Pune.
That's what I was waiting for.
I made a note of that. So I said, now clearly this law is a big issue. Anyway, I went to Pune. I joined the university. And, for me, temperamentally, if I decide that, okay, fine, this is what I have to do, I do it. 2 years later, I topped the university. So, of course, my uncle, by then had retired, was in his Nagpur house, was the guiltiest of all. So he drove down from Nagpur and by lunchtime he was in our house, and in Marathi he said, Kuthai amchi Ullas Murti. I'm going to take you out for lunch and buy you one sari for 1,000 rupees.
Wow. Look at
this
that.
is in 73. So I said, Kaka, I'll come for lunch with you. But it'll have to be 2 sarees worth 1,000 each. So he said, okay. But I also, my fear in my mind was that my mother was going to plot and plan these tea party types. Why did she want me back in Pune in the first place? I mean, what was I going to be doing there? But she didn't do anything of the sort. I was not put through any adverse. I was cruising along in my normal style, doing whatever I wanted.
But this is where you learned Marathi, right? When you actually
no. So after I finished MA, then,
okay.
Since I had topped, I had a job offer from all the colleges.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought very carefully about the whole situation, and I said Wadia College, thinking that no problem, I'll go and lecture in English. I didn't want to join Ferguson and SP and all this sort of thing. So anyway, I did. And on the very first day when I went to call on the principal to sort of, take the attendance, so Professor R.H. Gadgil. And it was at 7:15 in the morning. So he said, Kai mag Abhyankar bhai, your first lecture will always be Marathi medium. I said, Marathi medium? Do you have Marathi medium here?
Oh,
he said, of course, all colleges have.
Oh.
And first lecture is always Marathi medium. I said, but I can't lecture in Marathi. How can I teach them British Constitution? I can't lecture in Marathi. So he said, Kai Abhyankar bhai, tumchi matrubhasha ahe. By which time I felt like a rag and a rat and everything else that I could feel. And I said, no. Abhi de izzat ka sawal aa gaya yahan pe. This cannot happen. So I spent the next 6 months. You can imagine that for about around a 17, 18-year-old girl, social life is a very important part of one's life. So that came to a halt. And every evening I would sit and write out that lecture in English. Then to the best of my ability, translate it in Marathi.
Oh.
Whereas in English, I would have just gone and spoken.
Right.
Because I needed to translate, I wrote it first in English, then I translated in Marathi the best I could, then gave it to my father, who corrected the translation. And then I crammed it all night long to go and deliver it in the morning. So I thought that the best way to proceed is to be honest with the students. And I told them that I said, listen to me, I have never studied Marathi. I know how to speak. And it is true that I finished school from St. Mary's, but I was exempted Marathi by the time I joined. So you have to teach me the pronunciation. And if I'm making a mistake, help me with how to.
I would have never imagined this story. Like when I was reading up on your process and all of that, I honestly thought that you went back to Pune just as a place and you sort of learned Marathi organically, and that's how you sort of
No, 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 no,
translated the
no,
book.
not at
But
all.
this,
Entirely unplanned. And
yes,
I mean, I'm thinking, now when I think about it, I think I must be mad. So, no, and so they said that, Madam, so आमची पण अट आहे. We have a condition. I said, what's the condition? You teach us English. You help us with English. I said, yeah,
oh,
sure, done deal.
that's a nice bargain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this went on very happily, and I
Oh,
learned all
lovely.
kinds of big words and all this kind of thing. And that's how my ability to be able to read the stories in the poem. There are 17 poems in that booklet, which I could not translate because I don't have that level of Marathi. I understand it perfectly, but though, the nuance of a poem, then you need that skill with, you need that with the words and the vocabulary. I don't have that. And I could not find anybody who could do it either. They said that, this is very Sanskritized Marathi. It is very structured and old. I said, doesn't matter. It's Marathi. I can read it. I understand. But can you translate? But none of them that I spoke to, including in Pune. So that is how I translated bit by bit, but not
Right.
before I got my mother to read it. She said, these are very good stories. I got my aunt to read it. She said, brilliant. I wouldn't have expected it of her.
That is I want to add here, about how we understand our grandparents, or all like our loved ones, our family, with a certain lens, right? And
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
you just can't imagine that they've lived a whole different life from what you know about them. And I think for you it's also very interesting because it's not just a discovery of your grandmother, but also yourself. I think you've learned so
Myself,
much self
the
discovery
thing is
in the
this, it's,
process.
what you're saying is true, Brenda. I had not the foggiest idea about my grandmother as a person. But the fact that I knew everything about my grandfather, what he used to do and everything about him, he was the person. I'd never seen him. My father was about 17 when his father died. And I wanted to be a lawyer like him. And about my grandmother, so I'm thinking sometimes that, maybe it is that men's lives are public. They go
Exactly.
out of the house and do stuff. And, even if they're not alive and if they have achieved and they have done something, the family is inspired or talks about, but women, they get lost.
That is why I wanted to pick this book, especially, Ranjana. Like I was saying, right? There are a lot of women in translation, but I really wanted to give this coverage because I felt this book sort of brought to the limelight all those women who, because it's sort of like a domestic fiction, if we can call it, right? It's all these family
It is
dramas that,
domestic fiction.
yeah, that they have covered. And it's all these women who work in the houses, right? It's all these women who are striving to go out of these houses. And we'll get into, details later. But what I want to understand from you is, apart from love and apart from this obvious need to preserve your grandmother's stories, and also now because it's in English, it's reaching a wider audience. What I want to know is what about this topic made you translate it, for an audience of today, right? For example, how can a contemporary woman in a city relate to these stories which are sort of set in the 19th century in rural Maharashtra? How did you envision the reception to be?
Let me tell you, this is not rural Maharashtra. Her stories are spread across Bombay, Pune, Nagpur, rural Maharashtra, across. The important point of this work is also that as much as, India was divided into the provinces, the British provinces, and then you had the princely states. Now, the princely states, on the condition that, so long as they were not doing anything to oppose the paramount power, they could generally do what they felt like doing, and mostly they were encouraged to go to Paris and London and have a blast, sell their jewels and all that kind of thing. But they did not, have any risk, and they could govern their states the way that they could, whatever they felt like doing. So there was really nothing like a press or a great deal of freedom or any encouragement that you had in the provinces. Now, Bombay presidency. So we know a lot about women who lived and worked in the presidency. So whether it is Ramabai Ranade or whether it was Anandibai Joshi, who's telling you about her struggles of how she came about. She got married, she was in a state, but when she got married, she came and she lived in the presidency in Bombay. So we know a lot because you had the press, you had the magazines, and Maharashtra and Bengal were great centers for journalism and books and all kinds of things. My grandmother used to come to Pune. All her publications happened in Pune. Now, the fact that she came from a very, very established family, basically to the manor-born type family, she had no difficulty. So her stories are not biographical at all. She's not talking about her struggle. She had no struggle. But what the Navmatwadi focus was that you must reform and then hold the hand of the next one. She has composed a poem only for this republication that Aryabhushan did. And I think it's called Savinay Bhet or something like that. I forget the exact name of it. In that entire set of stories and poems, this covering poem is the only place where I found 2 lines which tell you about her family. One, that my father as a child taught me to hold the pen and write and educated me, and that I married such a cultured and wise husband who said, don't stop learning and writing. And that was her persona. And she took to it. And this was what every story says. You must get up and go and help the next person.
Yeah.
The other thing which I was very impressed is the involvement of the wives of the Navmatwadi leaders, the men, who are now busy in the sort of promoting political reform and other important things. For example, education. Now, education was a very big tool for them. And G.K. Gokhale, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was also of the same genre, he was member of the council then still in Calcutta. He had moved an education bill to make elementary education compulsory for all and to have a technical education center for only women. But the opposing side, those that did not want, emancipation, shot that bill down in the assembly. And because I am myself involved with this education, I have great interest in early learning. In 2009, you know that India passed the Right to Education Act. That act in 2009 universalized education for all up to elementary level, that's age 14 or 15, what Gokhale and Navmatwadi were trying to do. He had moved a bill in 1905, and Dadabhai Nauroji had also supported and spoken of it in the British House, where he was representing. But it's taken over 100 years for our country. So for me, these connections and to think of where are we
heading? Yeah.
And now from here, where are we going?
What next?
Forward?
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. And that's why, sort of as a young woman of today, when I was reading it, I was very conscious of the fact that there are people who have stood up for change, right? So there is most of the characters in the book are very inspiring. Yes, while there are supportive men, there are also women who sort of are very headstrong and who know what they want, which I find very inspiring, because we know that, see, now we are privileged, right? We do have now with internet. Exactly. And with the internet, with so many things opening up, I mean, things have become easier, right? And why I mentioned rural Maharashtra is also because, yes, even though there were, certain societies, certain people who were privileged, it's also a very small part of the community, right? But what I found really interesting, apart from this, Ranjana, is the fact that each story, right, though it is fiction, it actually is accompanied by a note. It's almost like a moral stories that you read as kids. And just for our listeners, to give them some context, for example, in the very first stories, there's a daughter-in-law who's harassed by her mother-in-law, right? And this theme keeps coming up in other stories as well, right? So in the note, the author mentions that daughters leave their homes, so at least in-laws, the least they can do is make them comfortable, right? Let alone harass them or torture them. The least you can do is sort of make them comfortable in an alien environment. And I really found that very interesting, because when I read fiction, when I read short stories, it's most often, you're supposed to gather any kind of interpretation when you read the short story, right? So I want to know, why do you think your grandmother included these notes? Like, why was it apparent? What was the need to make it really apparent, right? Because we don't often see this. And while you were translating, did you consider, not including the notes, or did you sort of think they were very essential to the part of it?
When long years ago, my mother was telling me about my grandmother. She was her personality. She was tiny. I was kind of Amazonian, I'm sure, but I was kind of Amazonian. And she had a staff, and her whole body language and aura was there's something which was magnetic. I would not describe her as beautiful in the same way as my mother's mother was, but there was something extremely, I don't know what, I don't have an adjective for it, but you looked at her, you're not inspired to be naughty one bit, but you felt attracted. I was always drawn to her, but I kept my distance because she had that. And my mother told me that, Moti Ai is a very practical lady. So I was listening to her. Normally, and she said that, early in the marriage, when my grandmother had a couple of daughters-in-law, she said that, now you sit here with me and we'll all have lunch together. So now these ladies said, Nana, but, so and so, the husband hasn't come. She said, no, no, no. You must be happy when your husband comes home. There's no need to wait for him, because you don't know whether he'll be half an hour late, 1 hour late, something held him up. You don't know all that. So this is our time to have our lunch. We will have our lunch. So first she used to have her lunch quite early. Then she would sit and serve her daughters-in-law and chat with them and this and that. Why? Because the minute your husband comes, there is no need for you to be in a bad mood and say, why is it taken you so? Why could you not send the boy to let me know?
Yeah, that's very
So
smart, very considerate of her. Yeah.
So when I read her authorial interventions, it's also because, the length of these stories is exactly as required for short stories in popular magazines. And the very fact that you have a household where many things are happening. Under the old mechanism, you had a widowed aunt or grandmother, her hair was shaved off, she wore a maroon colored sari. You may have had a widowed sister, small little girl, you're going to, college, so forth. Everybody living cheek to jowl, governed under different rules in your own home. But you're not seeing it. You're not recognizing it. But this happens also in our modern times. Very often, the mother in law is on one track, you're on another track. Nobody's trying to figure out, how are we going to get along? Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
I especially like the story where there is the second wife, and that's
Yes.
Saguna, and she has this little 5-year-old
Yeah,
where
stepmother. So it's,
the
yeah,
stepmother,
that's where the title
where
for the
yeah,
collection
so
comes from.
where the mother-in-law is now getting jealous because that little Yamuna is yummy as Yamu is very much in love with her new Ai, who's she and that authorial intervention she has where she's talking about women who gossip And she says that you have to be careful about the words and what you say in front of children and how that might affect them. Now, obviously, people are doing it without a care in the world. If all of us immediately knew that, no, this is not appropriate, you won't do it, isn't it? So, for her ordinary Marathi reading, in her readers, she's trying to point out to them that this is what is the problem for that little child. And that little child gets upset and, she's with the father and, all this kind of thing. All that happens. But she's also giving, I love that Leela Tai story, Leela Tai the fashionable, where here is it is true that my grandmother used her own circumstances. So there is a ghoda and a gadi and a pedder road and a Malabar hill and all those sorts of things. But here is Leela, who's completely obsessed with Western fashion and with the Parsi ladies who thing. And she, an Orthodox Brahmin family girl, is wearing socks and kid leather shoes when she reaches. I found that absolutely cute. When she reaches her matrimonial home the very first time, and I was saying, "Wow, I love this girl." But what she's saying is that not Western fashion is bad or anything new is bad. She's saying you need to learn to have a balance. There has to be a balance. So I would say that it is true. I mean, I have a daughter who's married. I will say that it is true for young people now also to say that no, I'm not going to learn anything about housekeeping. I don't want to know and this and that. And I used to tell my daughter that, the thing is, my for all your brilliance, I despair for you. That she used to ring me up and say, that yellow dal, not the one with the medium size. Oh, I'm saying, please don't call me up. What is this? And I'm thinking that, all of this, look, women have to play many parts. In your age, in your times, the husband will probably participate to a large extent, maybe fully. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, that home is your kingdom. When you say, I'm house proud, then it means something. These are realities of life. So women are super. I mean, they're super beings.
Exactly.
Men just don't stand. They completely don't fit the narrative here.
Yeah, no, that's what. And in your stories, that's what I realized. She's sort of shown women in a light that they can do everything and they can sort of carry it with grace, right? That's the beauty of it.
And there has to be a balance.
Yeah, and men, because we are talking about grace, I want to talk about one story which is my favorite actually. It's called the Educated Son-in-Law. And where I really liked that because she's sort of and the note in this story is, friends, please do not be bedazzled by wealth. It's more important to find a person who cares for you, than the sort of, being blinded by all of the jewels, all of the wealth that he has. So just for context for our listeners, so what happens in the story is, this woman gets married off to this man, and at first, she doesn't send something off. She's very happy that she's sort of married into a rich household. And obviously she has servants, she has everything that she wants. But what she finds out eventually is that her husband is not somebody who can keep that wealth. I found that concept very interesting. And just being rich is not enough, but knowing how to manage your wealth is more important. And this character sort of gets carried away, with anything. And there are people who take advantage of that, right? So he gets into he cheats on his wife, he sort of gets into gambling, and it goes downhill from there.
And there is a court case.
Yes, exactly. I was like, how, there was so much drama. I said, okay, what next? But what I liked in that story is there's a juxtaposition between another couple and to just see that even though they are not probably as well off, but they're happier, right? Because it's more of a match of minds, it's more of a match of values than to do with just, let's say, somebody's status, right? So could you please tell us, what inspired this particular story, Ranjana? Is it something that she sort of wanted to warn young girls against sort of, following for all these riches? Or, is it something that was sort of a norm, or was it like, did she sort of see a pattern that she thought of, she wanted to highlight?
Look, firstly, she was blessed with the fact that she has tremendous intellectual compatibility with her own husband. And as much as she had a foundation in her own father's home, she was married at the age of 14. And her trajectory, just that photograph which is in the book, she was around 40, in her very early 40s. Now, that situation of her, this business of marrying in wealth, it is a standard operating procedure to this very day. कि भाई अच्छे खानदान का है, खाता पीता घर है, ठीक है, all right, he's not as educated as you. I have been member of Women's Commission, and I can tell you that the number of girls who were educated, in that case, those that came to the commission were usually BA. The girl had done BA, the father of the boy was somebody who owned 3 shops, and the boy had dropped out of class 10. And then it didn't work intellectually, because after the first excitement is over, what do you talk about? What do you talk about? Where is the community? There's no meeting ground. But for me, the story on intellectual compatibility is that one on early marriage or adult marriage. Chandrika, who actually marries a wealthy man who knows how to keep his money, obviously, because he even has a huge estate with a tennis court, and there's one car for her and one for all of that. But ultimately, her spirit breaks, because try as she might, she does everything, including arrange, play tennis with him. It just doesn't meet. Those minds don't meet, and ultimately it breaks her spirit and she dies early. These are also facts of life. I mean, it's not
Yes.
that it happened. It could happen here today with anyone.
No, yeah, no, and I want to add to that, like, because out of personal experience, and this is someone who, a friend who shared with me, for example, so she's from a business family, okay, and she said that, Michelle, this is a thing that you sort of want to marry into a status which is similar to yours or higher. Right. And she tried to explain to her parents that she's in love with someone who's a salaried person. He has a job, he's doing well for himself, but that didn't matter. In their eyes, it was more like, no, but that's not what's going to keep you happy 10 years down the line. You need family money, you need all money. And she fought a very long battle with her parents, and eventually, touch wood, eventually they ended up together. But I do understand that the struggle is not outdated. That's what I liked about these stories.
It's
It is
not outdated.
very much today's concern. And just to sort of add to that, Ranjana, there's, as you mentioned, a very recurring character in the stories is a widowed person. She's often a young girl, and due to unfortunate circumstances, her husband passes away. But then everyone looks at this poor child. I would call them child, because in today's age,
The child, yeah.
they are children, and everyone looks at them as if there's something wrong with them, right? And there's also a line in the book which says they are not permitted to offer water to even the tulsi, and of course, in Hinduism, we know it's a sacred plant. So what I want to know from you is, how did this taboo originate? And I'm asking because, I mean, obviously I am ignorant. I have not come across something like that, and especially as a Catholic, this is not what I'm aware of. So I really want to know, where did this start, and what do you see happening today? And I would like to add that today we do know that a lot of people sort of look for dating options beyond 40, beyond 50, let's say second marriages, let's say if they are widows. We know that there are options now, and that's happening. But what, according to you, has changed over time, and when did it originate?
Look, firstly, what has changed over time is the age of marriage. And yet, there are child marriages in the country. And it is part of people's tradition. For example, in the building where I live, there is the electrician. So he's told me that his daughter is getting married. So I said, you let me know when you're going, I'll give a gift for her. So I said, so what does she do and all that? He said, abhi wo 10वीं mein hai. So I said, 10वीं mein hai? So how would, isn't she underage? So he laughed. He said, ऐसे ही होता है हमारे में. I said, ऐसे ही होता है क्या मतलब? अभी वो अपने घर वाले के साथ चली जाएगी. He said, नहीं नहीं नहीं, वो अब हमारे घर में रहेगी. फिर उसका गौना होगा, फिर वो जाएगी. And I'm thinking of these stories. The point is, you can have a law, but where it is deep rooted. So, Laxmibai is trying to get reform in her own community first. Every one of us needs to address our own community and its problems. For a large part, it will be the same. All parents saying, my daughter should get married to absolutely the top class family. All mothers think my son should marry the top class girl. That is natural. That is not wrong. But to take it to a point where you educate your daughter or son, but do not give them the freedom of
The
choice.
freedom, yes.
What is the point of this education? But you were talking about this friend who's maybe of modest means or so forth. For me, I saw it as the rise of an educated professional class of people who have become professional in context to becoming a lawyer or a doctor or something like that, where they want to earn money, renown, uh, status on their merit, which contrasts usually with these, wealthy people with estates and all that, either who are squandering and womanizing or who are just
Exactly.
completely, in their own realm.
Yeah.
But for me, the funny one was this business of playing tennis. There's that story in which he plays tennis. Now I'm thinking, where in Sangli could this tennis situation be happening? And I had no answer to it until this year in March. So I rang up my nephews and I said, listen, I'm looking for a picture of Motiai, but she needs to be younger. I've got, some pictures of her, but she's much older. So he said, okay, I think I'll go and check up. And so he sent me this photograph. So I said, wow, she's looking great. Now I have an old photograph of the day on which she got married to my grandfather. So I was trying to compare whether this lady and that lady are the same, and I recognize all the same jewelry. She's wearing exactly the same thing when she got married as she was wearing in that photo. So he said that, his grandfather, meaning my father's younger brother, he said, his Azoba remembered Motiai, his mother, like this. So I did some rough calculation, his age, this thing, that thing, and I figured that she would have been around 40 or so around the time that, so she would have been in the top sort of gear of her entire career. So that tennis, he told me, he said, and he didn't know that I was perplexed because he's not read the story. He said, she used to play tennis with Rani Sahib Sangli. I said, what? Who played tennis? Motiai used to play tennis with. I said, oh, okay. So then the penny dropped. That this story of, comes from there.
So and I just wanted to ask you, because I probably the tennis part was the most shocking, but my next question was, what was the most shocking thing that you learned during your research? Because, and another question as a follow-up is, why do research when you're literally translating the work, right? Like, what was the part of, I would say, what was the need for the research, and how did you sort of incorporate that in these stories?
So what it is that these stories are full of conversation. They're full of conversation. So now, in order for me to be able to, this is my personal thing, then I must have a context to that conversation. So when I noticed that this age 14 is recurring, then I said, is that to do with age of consent? Then now I'm a lawyer, so I did research on what was the first bill. Then I discovered that it was much earlier, in the late 1890s, when there was a case in Bengal, in Calcutta, of this 11-year-old girl who was married to a man who was 30. And in the morning, she was found dead of excessive bleeding. And there was a case, it did not say rape, but certainly, causing her harm, injury. And it was, it shocked the conscience that this 11-year-old child is dead of excessive bleeding. And then that is when that age was made to 12. And 14 came much after this story. Now, I know the time when the republication happened, which is around 1914, when Aryabhushan republished, and the profits of the sale of these books, she gave permission to donate it to the great Maharishi Karve. So Dhondo Keshav Karve was a pioneer in widow remarriage. and widow education, and he set up the Anath Balika Ashram and the Stree Shikshan Sansthan in Pune. And it's a great many institutions under that. He was given the Bharat Ratna in due course. So Motiai donated, she and he were comrades in arms. They were sort of working on the same thing. So the proceeds were given there. And I found myself gifted a copy of G.K. Gokhale's speeches. So I was running through that and suddenly came across this precise speech which he delivered in the council on education. And he's quoting Sangli and saying that, quoting my grandfather, who established the municipality there, has achieved 100% literacy, enrollment and literacy. And that is an example. And therefore, we have to advance education for women, and there must be elementary education. So what? That bill that I've done. That speech is 1905. Then I did further research and turned out that Dadabhai Naoroji also, in England was supporting the same thing. And then I did further research only to find that this bill was defeated by those that opposed emancipation of women. That is when I got the context. They were talking about how the self-governance support should be because the bill had not yet been passed. For example, the Morley Minto reforms of 1909, the conversation in one of the stories, they're talking about what kind of local self-government should there be. So what kind of will have context to be before?
Yeah.
So therefore, I did a lot of research.
So I think you as a translator, for you to understand that world itself took a lot of research. Okay, now, it makes sense
then
because
I could get to the best of my ability, get the vocabulary to put in the mouth of these people. Otherwise, it's a blank translation without, it won't have had a live show, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's very interesting. So like I said, it's not just knowing about your grandmother, but it's your self-discovery. There was a lot that happened. So I want to know, especially about, let's say, the positive aspect, like we see there are a lot of antagonists in the story, the evil mother-in-laws, and this jealousy, petty jealousy, all of that happening. We also see a common thread of supportive husbands, right? Who, despite their mother's regressive attitude, they encourage their wives to, study, pursue their dreams. And we know that, your grandfather was also very supportive. So do you think her own experience influenced these male characters? Can you please give us an anecdote or an example?
So she was my grandfather. Laxmibai was his second wife. His first wife and his mother had died in the plague. There was in 1893 to 96, there was plague and famine right across the country. And during this, where there was segregation, forced segregation happening, the dead from the barely alive type segregation, he lost his wife and his mother, left behind an infant daughter and his grandmother. When he came to Sangli, he was sent to Sangli with his brothers. He had 3 younger brothers, and they were dispatched with the baby and grandmother, and they set up home in Sangli to get English education. So my grandfather's around 11 and the others were younger, and this baby. So he got married to her. He was, that much older. But at 14, when she married him, she arrived as a mistress of the Abhyankar house, which had 1 daughter. She already had this, the baby of whom she was the stepmother. My eldest Bua, my eldest Atya, was that baby. And she had 4 younger brothers. Oh. And she had a grandmother-in-law.
Wow.
Now this grandmother-in-law, as I'm told by my mother and my father, her name was Janaki Bai. And in these stories, mostly the ladies she calls Janaki Bai are very understanding. It is a tribute to her own grandmother-in-law, who enabled her to get to the ropes. At 14, what do you know about running a house? And especially if you come from a very privileged background and all that, you probably know a little bit less than otherwise, people might have known. So her own experience was extremely warm and enabling altogether. She was blessed. She was truly blessed. which is where I think
Yeah.
she gets this whole thing of telling her daughters-in-law that, listen, you come here, you have dinner, you have your lunch.
Yes, yes.
You don't have to stay hungry for him.
Yeah. No, it is definitely. I think for me, especially, just reading about these family dynamics, because I love reading family drama. It was so full of drama, right? Like I said, and I think what I really liked was the relationships that she sort of focused on, right? Even if, like we said, these evil characters were regressive and all of that, I think towards the end, she always aims for sort of a happy ending. I've noticed that sort of coming full circle with them, and sort of patching up, with these characters. I really want to understand what was the kind of backlash that your grandmother must have received for writing these stories, because we do know that at that point it was quite progressive at that stage, right? So did you sort of read upon the reception that it got, and why did the work disappear after a point in Marathi?
So the thing is this, that she launched a campaign against tonsuring of women, widows, uh, in Sangli. And she was very vociferous. Now, she had a husband for a lawyer, so she was able to correctly position her language, her everything. She had a lot of support with that. With the result that the entire barber community of Sangli had boycotted the Abhyankar house, which she had 5 sons. So, as my father said, we used to sit and cut each other's hair because nobody to cut our hair. But as far as what your question is, Prabodhankar Thackeray, you heard the name? He was vociferously against her. He wrote an article to say, Kon ahe hi Lakshmi Sachichi Rani, who is saying all that, and threatened a criminal case against her. She, of course, ignored the whole thing, carried on doing whatever she was doing. She was not the one to back down. So, of course, there was criticism. There was sharp criticism to all the Navmatwadis, and particularly where women are now stepping out to say this or that, and then they're
Yeah.
writing and speaking and doing all of these other things. Of course, she had.
And so this is just a follow up to that. So while she's aware that there's a backlash, and yes, she must have obviously found a good publisher who believes in her work. Did you think that she would sort of censor the kind of language or censor the kind of themes or topics anytime after the backlash?
I doubt it. No, I don't think so.
That's
I
brave.
have in that book provided alliteration of 4 poems. And when I was writing that alliteration for this poem, which she calls Plague, where there are these people who are under forced segregation, barely alive, trying to rush to the Pune railway station to get on top of the carriage trains just to get away, to run away from the death of plague to the safety of their villages. I was seeing in front of me the hordes of people who were walking when the lockdown happened. It was very moving. The way in which she's written this, and this is exactly what was happening. In the first instance, when trains and everything had been halted, they were walking. They died there, they gave birth there, but they walked hundreds upon hundreds of miles. Koi Bihar ja raha hai, kahin ja raha hai, people stranded. What have we done? There's still migrants who come into the cities for work.
Yeah.
There's still poverty and there is still unemployment. What has changed? So these are very big issues. But then there's another alliteration. There are 2 poems in that which I found fascinating. One is a ode to somebody called Nagutai Joshi. Now, this lady has completed a 5-year course of licentiate in medicine and surgery. But you could not do an MD, but she must have done it in Bombay, presumably, or Sassoon Hospital. But then she's become a doctor after 5 years of study. The next poem is her thoughts on seeing this young girl whose hair is getting tonsured, and she's a young child, and she's sitting silently, crying, not knowing that this is the first initiation practiced for lifelong widowhood. It breaks your heart. It's completely heartbreaking. So you see, social reforms is always a politically sensitive issue. And as much as you might want social reform, the point is you have to bring it within yourself and your family and then one at a time, because politics has a way of getting into it.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like apart from your grandmother, because after reading this book, I am, sort of very, very interested in that time period. And especially because I wasn't in India. So I grew up in Bahrain, in the Gulf. And of course, I studied CBSE. So we had a very limited viewpoint, very limited scope of work, as you know, right? History, geography, all of that. And I do want to read up more. So I'm really curious to know, during your grandmother's time, were there other women writers who were writing in a similar space? And were they approaching similar themes? Or did you sort of, in your research, come across writers who were writing different kind of stories at that point, female writers?
I don't know. I've not done the research on whether there were others writing short stories. I'm 100% sure that they would have been. There would have been women who were writers. But there were many who are published for example, work by Pandita Ramabai Ranade, Anandi Joshi, and many others. There are men who have written. One of the defining books of that time is entitled Pan Aiktai Kon. Who is going to listen? And that is by Hari Narayan Apte. About child widows. It was, it's a fact. And the great thing about Aryabhushan Press was that the Navmatwadis wanted to bring low-cost publications of the great works so that they would be available to every man in the street if he wanted.
Yeah, like easily accessible.
Yeah. So it was an entire ecosystem. And like I said, where the men were going outside and, koi assembly mein, koi whatever they were doing, the women were doing these little ladies groups after organizing their homes and teaching them. I was reading one of the stories where she's telling them about childbirth and what kind of nutrition you need and what stuff like that, basic things. Point is that when many things happen in our lives. Either we get used to seeing it, or we might think that, it shouldn't happen like this. I don't know why she behaved like this. And we move on.
Yes.
There's nothing that is different. The family dynamics, after all, human nature is the same.
Yes.
Just because you lived 100 years ago doesn't make, and if you're modern, then and still not realizing this, you got a problem here.
Yeah, and these kind of, these small quarrels that these mother-in-law, daughter-in-law have, it sort of took me, this flashback mode, because I'm not married, but when I travel by the local train, right, to go to work or to go to other places, there's crowd around you, and you tend of, you eavesdrop without intending to eavesdrop. And there are, this is a conversation that I've heard again and again, where a working woman sort of, they're going to work outside whole day, and they are, common complaint is I return home and then I have to face my mother-in-law. And I used to wonder, but okay, how is this a situation even today, right? And I think reading these stories sort of, it feels very timeless, and it's kind of sad.
It's timeless.
Where I do hope that things change, because the book is meant to sort of change.
It needs women to change.
Yes.
If there are regressive customs, for sure it is patriarchy.
Yeah.
But women need to change.
Yes.
There is a story in one of these where this girl is asking her mother-in-law, aunt, or whoever, but why is it like that? I mean, that we are not allowed to this and that. But we don't have to ask all this. The Rishi Munis of the old time, they must have had a good reason. Why are you asking? That is also the thing.
Yes.
Parampara. What is this parampara?
Yeah. And it reminds me,
women are equal culprits in supporting the system.
Correct. Matriarchy, which is what I want to bring up, because I recently watched Karan Johar's movie Rocky or Rani, and I didn't expect.
What is it called?
Rocky or Rani ki Prem Kahani. So it's like when I actually sort of wanted to not wanted to watch the movie. When I went to watch the movie, I went with no expectations. And when I came back, it sort of made me really think about how well it sort of, portrayed patriarchy, yes, but also matriarchy. So there is a matriarch in the family who literally sort of, I would say, makes people, act in a very regressive way, right? You don't often think about that. You think about, oh, patriarchy,
Exactly.
yes, but it is a woman who is sort of, and I really
Yes.
liked, yeah.
She props this up. And the
Yes.
other thing which I
Yes.
definitely, made a point of is that when the girl became a widow, she was packed up back to her parents' home. In all these cases, she's
Yeah.
packed up back to the parents' home.
Hmm.
The husband's family doesn't want to take
Just
responsibility.
yes, yes. It's
I
like you
found
have
that,
no value after that. It's just
yeah,
very
I mean,
sad.
she's going to be a burden. I mean, no requirement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in her own home, which should be that ecosystem of protection and
Love
care,
and
is
warmth.
the
Yeah.
worst ecosystem for every girl, from birth
Yeah.
to death.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what is this ecosystem?
Really, really. It's
And
just
then on the
sad.
one side, you say
Hmm.
that, you have Devi, Devta, the goddess and this and that. I found that frightening, actually.
It is, yeah. No, and this all these stories sort of, and as you said, we have a choice to either turn a blind eye or do something about it,
Or
right?
just, no, or
And
apart from, I just said, you're so insensitive that you don't notice.
yeah, exactly. Because you think it's routine. That's what. So I want to mention a short story. I'm not sure if you like reading horror sort of short stories, but there's a story by Shirley Jackson, which was it's an old story, old classic story. It's called The Lottery. And I usually teach this in my creative writing classes. I love to discuss it because I felt it's a very good example. It sort of shows you that society can do anything blindly in the name of rituals, in the name of customs, even if it is extremely disturbing, right? So, I don't want to give spoilers for the story, but basically what happens is that people innocently do things. They sort of think like it's innocent just because we have been doing this over the years. Let's just continue doing it. And towards the end of the story, you are just sort of, you're. I was at least speechless when I reached the end of the story. It's very disturbing, by the way. It's a very disturbing end, and hence I would call it horror. But basically, I think what even the writer was trying to say is that we humans can be really, really evil and sort of disguise the evil acts that we do in the name of rituals, in the name of customs, without really thinking about it. And I feel that your book was a very good reminder for that. At least I learned so much, and I
I
really, really
learned a
loved
lot.
knowing
I learned a
about
lot
that time.
because, Michelle, I am involved with education. And I am involved with some NGOs that support education of underprivileged. It's a very hard life. It's a very hard life to begin with. Then on the top of that, you have all these stuff that holds you back. Your own family will hold you back. I'm not able to understand how it's going to happen. And then,
Yeah,
2 steps forward, 3 steps back, then again 2 steps forward, and maybe you manage 1 step ahead. It's very unfortunate, and yet there is a lot of hope in those stories, because those girls who really get on and who then finally reconcile, there is hope. It's possible. It's
yes,
possible to move. And yet where there are parents who just simply, now they realize it, but it's too late. That daughter is committing
exactly.
suicide.
Yeah, you often hear this
Yes,
in the news,
yes,
and it just
yes,
shakes you from
yes.
within. Like literally, when a child tells you, I'm sorry, when your child tells you that there's something off, I'm not comfortable here, and there's always this word compromise. I've always heard this sacrifice, compromise. Marriage is meant to be a union where, yes, I totally get it that any kind of relationship requires that. There are also limitations to that, and the issue is that I think, girls, even though we are so progressive, we have reached a point where we make our own decisions. There's always this feeling, right? Like they say, log kya kahenge?
Log
Always.
kya kahenge? Big thing.
That's what I think that's something we really need to work on. But yeah, as you said, there's hope. These stories give us hope. And this brings us to the last round of the interview. Ranjana, this is a fun round. It's a rapid fire round. Okay. So you'll have to answer in one line or one word. Okay. One word to describe your grandmother's ambition.
Towering.
Okay. The biggest hurdle that you faced while translating her work?
Inadequate skill of the language. I had to ask for dictionaries from my mother, even though I was pretty proficient after the Wadia College experience. But I did need, and my regret is that I could not do the poems.
Right. Okay. If these stories could eradicate one social taboo in our society completely, which one would it be?
Freedom of choice.
Okay. One character from the book that you wish you met in real life?
I don't know. The girl who played tennis, Chandrika.
Yes, I think you're really in love with her. Okay. One trait that you have inherited from your grandmother?
I like playing tennis.
Lovely. Okay. What will you be translating next?
Nothing.
Okay.
If I'm informed, I mean, I learned from the obituary that was published by the Sakar, a cousin sent it, that she had withdrawn from public life, but she had turned to philosophy and such likes. That she has written her memoirs, and it's called Kahi Sukhaste Kshan, some moments of happiness. So I imagine that would have been her life with her husband or in her own family. I am told that everything that is ever published, one copy of it is sent to the National Library in Calcutta. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So if that be the case, then perhaps it's there. And if we should find each other, then I will translate that.
Oh, I really hope that happens. Because I feel with this book you've managed to sort of resurrect these stories. Like I said, they're hidden, and like you said, women's lives, and on this podcast we've also covered a lot of books where they sort of bring these women to light, right? Like, so be it Ira Mukherjee, Manu Pillai, all of these historical fiction writers who bring all these women from Indian history forward, and I think this book also does the same. So I really hope that you do translate more of this work. But thank you so much for this conversation, Ranjana. It made me think a lot, and it really, really struck my conscience that, like you said, help yourself. It starts with home. It starts at home. It starts small, but also help, the people around you. So thank you so much. It was
Michelle, it's been a delight, and thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.